Go ahead, Wendy.
So I wanted to announce that we have 2 sets of Project Wild workshops coming up. In April, just barely a month away, a little bit more than a month, for April 20th, 6 to 9 is Growing Up Wild. The field work is actually incorporated into the workshop, so it's 3 hours straight, and we've got 2 people interested, but we need 5 in order for the Alamo Area Master Naturalist to be able to participate. So I'm recruiting tonight. I'll tell you what you need to do in order to get registered. The other workshop is not till July, but it's easy to remember because it's July 20th and July 27th with a weekend in between. So it's going to be 6 to 8 on the 20th. And then you do 2 hours of homework. And for those of you that did Aquatic Wilds, sort of like that, only of course for Project Wild, different projects. And then on the 27th, you do 6 to 8 again. And so we have 2 people interested in each of those workshops, and they need 3 friendly Alamo Area Master Naturalists because we have to have a minimum of 5 to register as a chapter. If you are interested, you can email me. People did that last time, and I'll pass it on to Kiki Corey, or I will put in the chat her email right now, but it's kiki.corey at uppercase TDWD dot uppercase T texas.gov, and the Kiki Corey has a capital K and a capital C. So I'll put it in the chat. But if you have any questions, they're really a lot of fun, both of the workshops, and I encourage people to give them a try. So if you have any questions, I'll put my email in also, and you can also email me. Thank you, Peter and Amanda.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. And Wendy, I'm assuming also it's on the newsletter and
But it has the wrong information on the newsletter. That's
okay.
fine.
Okay, yes. So Wendy will put it out in the chat in a couple of seconds, and that's anything else, Wendy?
Nope, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's just get started with our presentation for tonight. It is Kirchoff, Don Kirchoff is our presenter tonight. He's with the Kirchoff Farms in Floresville, Texas, and that's kind of my stomping grounds now in Wilson County. So I'm glad to have him here and glad to see him. Well, we won't be able to see him because he's having camera problems, but or maybe we will. We may fix it, but we'll be able to see his presentation. So some of us have volunteered at the Kirchoff farm, and it's a restoration farm of 200 acres. And I won't steal the thunder from Don, so I'll turn it over to Don. It's your show.
Okay, thank you, Peter and Amanda. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Is my audio working okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's see. All right. Well, thank everybody for participating this evening and for giving me the opportunity to share with you how we are restoring a tall grass Blackland prairie to the Kirchoff family farm where I grew up, as Peter said, in Wilson County. It's about a little over half an hour drive south of downtown San Antonio. And what we're going to discuss this evening is the process we've gone through for about 10 years, the resources that have been invested, and the critical role that volunteers have played in this restoration process, and then take a look at some of the results and outcome of these efforts. When we look at the process we went through, the first thing we did was fail. We spent a couple of years buying some expensive prairie seed and planting them the same way our parents planted ordinary crops, and that just didn't work. We did not know at that time that you can't just plant a prairie. So having failed for a couple of years, we sought some professional advice. The advice they gave us was to start on a small scale, learn how to restore native plants, and then move on to full-scale restoration. And while we were doing that, we wanted not only plants to recover, but we wanted the wildlife to recover as well. This was our starting point. It's the 200-acre farm that I grew up on with my siblings. Our parents purchased this in 1952. There are about 30 acres of riparian forest. Let me get a proper pointer here. There's about 30 acres of this riparian forest, and then 170 acres of row crop land. I wanted to point out that there are 3 types of fields 10 years ago on this farm. There was these 2 green areas were coastal Bermuda. This long brown strip right here was basically grazers. Our parents planted grazer here. They ran cattle on it. And then all the rest of the field here was in row crop. Now, today we've restored all of that as much as you can in 10 years to a native prairie, but it nevertheless is still like a postage stamp floating in tens of thousands of acres around us that are row crop farming, pasture land, ranching, and so forth. So that's the current environment. When we were advised to start small, it was suggested that we locate remnant stands of native plants and do this by finding old cemeteries, abandoned railroad tracks, bridges, old bridges across creeks and rivers, and collect some native seeds, grow them in trays, and then transplant seedlings to the prairie in a controlled environment. And this made a lot of sense to us because after the first 2 years, it became very apparent that planting native plants in an environment like we have today, the environment was nowhere close to what it was a century ago when native plants thrived. So we had to push the environment back a little bit so that these native plants could survive. Our starting point was to research Wilson County and look for some old cemeteries. And we found several. This was a great location. This was on private land, so we never did attempt to get on it, but we were able to see the tombstones and statues from a distance. But what really attracted us were these huge old trees, which told us that this area right here must have remained undisturbed for a long, long time. So it was areas like this that we located to look for remnant stands along the public roads. And you've got to remember that my siblings and I had been away from the farm for decades. We really did not know the difference between a native plant and an invasive plant. So what we did is we photographed grasses and forbs like these. We sent the pictures to Chris Best, the state botanist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services in Austin. Sometimes we cut clippings from the plants. And Chris told us what we were finding, whether a particular plant was native or it was non-native, we should avoid it. And we watched the native plants, and when they produced some seed, we collected them and planted them in trays at our homes. And this was quite successful. We were able to grow quite a few different types of grasses and forbs. And then the next step was to take these seedlings we had growing in trays and plant them in a controlled environment on the farm. To do this, we took the old cow pen, which was an acre or a little bit more than an acre. And while we were collecting seeds and growing them in these trays, we were also disking this cow pen. We would disc it, and then when it rained, literally millions of undesirable plants would come up. We would disc it again, we'd get another rain shower, disc it again. We did that about 4 times over the period of time we were collecting and growing these seeds in trays. Then we brought them out here to the farm, and we laid these drip lines, which you can probably see here in the bottom middle of this frame. And on top of the drip line, we placed a weed barrier, and then we inserted our seedlings through that weed barrier. And this was remarkably successful. In a short period of time, we had a large number of native grasses and native forbs growing in this cow pen. We watched them as they grew and made seed. We learned when and how to collect those seeds when they would be viable. We built some screens, we cleaned the seeds, and we began building up quite an inventory of native grasses and forbs that came from remnant stands of native plants right around our property. And this is 10 years ago, so some of these weren't even available commercially at the time. So with that experience under our belt, we then went to a full-scale restoration. And in looking back, that really had 3 phases. There was a preparation phase, planting, and then maintenance. And preparation was by far the most important. Not getting this right, we would not have had any of the other phases. So taking a look at both of these, I mean, all 3 of these, let's go back to the aerial photograph I showed initially, what the farm looked like when we started. Remember, I said it had 3 kinds of fields. There were these coastal Bermuda fields, this strip that had been planted in grazer for decades, cattle ran on it, and then the row crop fields. Each of these fields was very different, and it required a different approach to preparation. If any of you who have tried to kill Bermuda, whether it was coastal Bermuda or common Bermuda, it's very difficult stuff to kill. We were advised to graze this heavily for the year. And then as we approached the summer, took the cattle off and applied application of glyphosate. It would rain, some of the coastal wasn't killed, it greened out, we'd spray it again. We did that 3 times in these coastal Bermuda fields to kill almost all of it. We still didn't get every single one, but pretty close. Then we turned our attention to the pasture grass field, which, as I had mentioned earlier, had cattle running on it for decades. So the seed bank of undesirable plants in there was huge. And we were advised to give that field rent-free to the renter, who was renting all the rest of the property and had been doing so for at least a decade, and just let him plant his Roundup Ready corn or Roundup Ready maize, because what he was doing with modern farming techniques is he was spraying these fields several times a year with Roundup. And so that really depleted the seed bank of undesirable plants in this pasture grass field. Now, the row crop fields was a different story. That was actually the easiest to restore because the renter had been using modern farming techniques, had planted his genetically modified grains, sprayed the field several times a year with Roundup. So the seed bank of undesirable plants in these row crop fields was quite small. All we needed to do was plant directly into undisturbed soil, into his corn and maize stubble without disturbing the soil in any way. So that was the preparation. And the coastal Bermuda field was a robust, very healthy, produced a lot of hay every year and nutrition for the cattle. And we were going to kill this stuff. And I'm sure the neighbors around us thought we were nuts doing something like this. But our goal to get a prairie was to start with a sterile field. All the fields needed to be sterile with basically diminished seed bank in the soil. So this was basically the outcome that we wanted during the preparation phase, which then brought us to planting. Now, the planting phase was going to be quite expensive, and we needed some financial assistance with that. For that, we applied to the Natural Resource Conservation Service for a WIP cost sharing grant. This is a Wildlife Habitat Improvement Program grant. It, of course, gave us the advice and information we needed, as well as paid for about half the cost of planting 170 acres. NRCS identified the seed mixes that we needed. We bought what we could, what was available at every planting event. We bought all of our seeds from Douglas King Seeds. We planted with their special no-till drill. We had 4 planting events over a 3-year period. The planting conditions and the weather after planting was varied every time. We had 2 planting events in early May, 2 planting events in early September. And then following those planting events, the weather conditions were different. Sometimes it was dry, sometimes it was wet, and every one of those planting events produced a different outcome. Planting days looked like this, planting directly into the stubble without stirring the soil in any way. Scott, my brother, did most of the planting. And this is a very interesting photograph in what it's telling us. In the September planting events, of course, that follows August, one of the hottest months, or maybe the hottest, driest month of the year. And each of those planting events in September, we planted directly into dust, very dry soil. But both of those 2 years, we got very lucky. Within a week after the planting events, the September rains arrived. We had wet fall in both of those years. And this was the outcome of a planting event in the fall in September when we had a wet fall. This is switchgrass in only its second year of growth, and it reached a height of 9 feet. And what you don't see in this picture is all of the short and medium-sized grasses, but I'll show you that in some subsequent pictures. So as we were planting the 170 acres, we of course needed to get into management techniques as the new prairie plants emerged. And one of the critical management techniques is to control the invasive species. This was a challenge I think none of us, at least my brother and sisters, had no idea the effort that this was going to require. The introduced grasses, because we are like a postage stamp in an ocean of introduced grasses around us. And then the woody invasive plants we had to address were backrus, weesach, and mesquite. Other methods of maintaining the prairie that we have underway is prescribed grazing, hay production. We would like to use fire, but the outcome or the result of fire is unknown in South Texas. So we're engaged with a Texas Parks and Wildlife Department controlled burn test. And we did some shredding early on, and I'll show you a picture of how that impacted what we were doing. And we bought a stalk cutter. My brother calls this his steel buffalo herd. This time of year, there's a pretty tall switchgrass stubble or stalks, dormant or dead, left over from last year. And we're doing an experiment where we run a stalk cutter over a few acres every year just to see, to actually mimic a buffalo herd, and to see whether that causes the grass in the spring to green out any faster. Now, this is a very interesting picture on what it's telling us. This is a field in its fourth spring after a September planting event. What we see here is lots of high biodiversity of short grasses. These are grasses like bristle grasses, gamma grasses, windmill grasses, buffalo grass, and so forth. Then there's a collection of these mid-height grasses like four-flower trichloris and Rhodes grass, little blue stem, silver blue stem, and so forth. And then you see these scattered big clump grasses and a whole bunch of them here in the distance. All of this is switchgrass. But what really stands out in this picture is all of this green stuff. That's backrus. And in the first 3 or 4 years of prairie restoration, at least in our deep black soil, where the prairie is not yet robust, there is bare dirt mingled in with this grass. And wherever there's bare dirt, these invaders jump right up out of the ground. Now, backrus in our fields would get 7 to 9 feet tall in 1 year. They'd get dense. They would completely crowd out this recovering mix of plants that we had planted. So if we didn't use chemical treatment here, we would not have a prairie today. We had to treat these with 2,4-D. Backrus is very susceptible to 2,4-D. We always tried to spray when it was 4 feet or shorter. In periods when it got ahead of us, like 5 to 8 feet, we would shred it. We would shred about a foot high so we would not damage these medium height grasses. In fact, we would shred around these tall switch grasses, get the backrus down to about a foot, it green out a little bit, the tender growth could be killed very easily with chemicals. So that's how we control the backwoods. Another of the really serious challenges we had was with all this little weesatch, especially in the early years. And thank God for master naturalists, because in the 2 autumns of the years when the weesatch was the worst, we had a lot of volunteers come out. They would cut the weesatch with loppers, treat the stumps with remedy diesel mixture, and thereby we helped suppress that weesatch invasion. But oftentimes the weesatch would get ahead of us, and we'd have to go after it with power tools. This is my sister Brenda using a brush cutter, or we would use a pole saw to reach underneath these trees, cut them at the bottom, and treat the stumps. And even that didn't always work. One of the years we had well over 1,000, I would say, weesatch that got 8 to 10 feet tall, too big to handle even with hand power tools. So we had to hire this contractor to come out here with this big piece of equipment. He pulled all these weesatch up by the roots and stacked them into piles, which made excellent bird habitat. But that was a very expensive method of making bird habitat. But when we really kept after those woody invaders and kept them suppressed, the outcome was a robust, high biodiversity prairie after about 4 or 5 years. And again, now you see in this particular picture, a dense covering, very little, if any, bare dirt anymore. A lot of these short grasses that are already named medium height grasses, and then all of this clump grass, which on our prairie, almost all of it is switchgrass. Now, at this point, we had a robust prairie underway, a restoration underway, and we engaged in another management technique, and that is prescribed grazing. We didn't have any cattle anymore. Cattle had been sold many years earlier, but the neighbors have a lot of cattle, and they love bringing cattle onto our prairie because of this excellent native grass that's growing here. And the way we've been achieving prescribed grazing is, I don't know if you can see, but there's an electric fence right here. We applied for a GRIP grant from Oaks and Prairie's joint venture. GRIP is G-R-I-P, Grassland Rehabilitation or Restoration Incentive Program. And that money helped us put in cross fencing, which divided our property into 5 pie slices with water and supplements in the middle when the cattle brought in. And using a large number of cattle in a relatively small area, mimicked a buffalo herd where they would be forced to eat all of the grass down and not just their sweetest or favorite grasses. Another management technique we're using is to make hay. A healthy prairie makes a great deal of forage, and we need a revenue stream to pay the bills for the prairie. This is my brother Scott taking a sample of the hay for nutrition testing. We get this hay nutrition tested. And the way we manage this is we select a few acres every year to do the to make hay on. Another management tool that we would like to use is fire, because fire was native to the prairie, but it is uncertain in South Texas whether a fire in a prairie environment will promote the invasive plants recovery more rapidly or the native plant recovery more rapidly. So to answer that question, we're working with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department on a control burn test. Jamie Killian, our a biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife, wrote the plan for this. We have set aside 4 3-acre test plots. And in year 1, we burned 1 acre in each of the 4 plots. In year 2, we burned that same acre plus 1. Last summer was the 3rd summer. These are summer burns, but it rained during the period of time we needed to burn. We didn't get to burn. which means that this summer we will be burning, or we plan to burn, all 3 acres in all 4 test plots. And with 2 years of growth, there's a lot of fuel there. So we're going to see a lot of fire when we light these test burn plots this summer. While we were getting plants to recover, we also wanted the wildlife to return. To encourage that, we applied for a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services PFW grant. That's Partners for Fish and Wildlife. That was a cost-sharing grant. We paid half the cost, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife paid half the cost for these top 4 projects. One was to install 3 wildlife guzzlers. Another was to install 3 burrowing owl roost sites. We planted a 50-foot wide green tree pollinator fire break around Prairie headquarters, and planted 10 diversity plots. Fast forwarding a few years, when the Prairie was recovering, we noticed just a lot of invasive plants, grasses blowing in onto our property from properties to our south. One thing we noticed that was in the south fence line, there was about a 50-yard interval where there was a bunch of brush growing in the fence line, and we had no invasive plants on the downside of that brush line. And that led us to think that we could plant a windbreak along our south fence line, which we have done. I'll describe that in a little bit. And then more recently, volunteers who've been working on our Prairie have proposed a couple of projects which are now underway. One is a Manfreda maculosa project, and one is the very interesting Cornell Lab Nest Watch project. I will describe each one of these. The very first project we installed under the PFW grant was to construct 3 wildlife guzzlers. This was an Eagle Scout project. The Scouts built a catchment out in the field, and I hope you can see the guzzler over here to the right. This is what that looked like. A guzzler is a roof built out in the prairie with gutter that collects water, delivers it to a 550-gallon storage tank, which delivers water to the guzzler in the ground here. Now, what is remarkable is that you build it and they will come. It was just amazing, the turnaround in wildlife that we saw. We had not seen quail on the farm when it was row crop for at least 10 or 15 years. But within the first 2 years of restoration, when we had a plant diversity return and we had some water available, the quail population went up. It skyrocketed. And so did the population of many other birds and other wildlife. And of course, that brought back the predators. For the last 4 or 5 years at these guzzlers, we see the mama bobcats with their baby kittens, as well as foxes, coyotes, and many other kind of wildlife. Our second PFW project was to construct 3 burrowing owl roost sites. This was an Eagle Scout project. The design that the Scouts used was to take a 55-gallon drum, cut it in half, bury it, and then connect it to an 8-inch pipe, a flexible plastic pipe that came up to the surface. And again, we found you build it and they will come. As soon as we had these burrowing owl roost sites in, we would see owls show up generally in the first week of October. So that told us what we were seeing were the migratory birds coming in from farther up north in North America. But another thing we noticed is what else loved these burrows. In fact, the other animals like armadillos, possums, skunks, rodents, snakes, ground squirrels lived in these things. In fact, so many of them lived in there. They very quickly ate their way through these pipes and they would fill these passageways with dirt. We could clean these passages out, and sometime overnight, the animals that were living in there would fill it up. So the owls really never got to use this design on our property, but many other animals did, and the predators knew it. bobcats, fox, and coyotes would spend their time around these, especially at night, when our cameras would catch them, like this bobcat reaching inside trying to get something to eat. What that design told us was we needed a different type of design for a burrowing owl roost site on our property. Therefore, in September of 2020, we put in one 8-inch diameter pipe through one terrace. Let's see if that, got that out of the way. Okay. And on each end of this 8-inch diameter pipe, we put a predator exclusion fixture, about 4.5-inch diameter hole, which would allow owls to get in, but most rodents not. Put a little roof over it. Now, we did this in September 2020, into September, and 2 weeks later, first week in October, a burrowing owl shows up and lived in this burrow from first week of October 2020 all the way until February of last year, 2021. Now, the Raptor Rehabilitation Center in Dallas became aware that we had an artificial burrow that an owl was living in. And they called us and said, well, they had restored a burrowing owl in Dallas that had run into a building and was paralyzed. And they had restored it to health and wanted to know if they could release it in our burrow. Well, of course, we said yes. They drove that little owl all the way from Dallas to Wilson County and released it in our burrow. Now, this occurred in February, at the end of February last year, which was the time that the other owl left. So both owls were gone. But we learned something from that. We learned that perhaps, at least in the type of soil and plant life, animal life that we have, we needed 8-inch pipes for burrows. Therefore, we installed one with T-shape, two with elbows like this, and then we put in 4 that were straight pipes. And we did all of this in September 2021, just last year. And when I say we, again, it was volunteers, particularly Alamo area master naturalists came out, helped us install all of these burrows in September of last year. And sure enough, in first week in October last year, 1 or 2 owls showed up. We could see them in our cameras. The predators knew it, and that was really interesting because wherever the owls were, the predators were there to try to dig them out, but they could not get inside these pipes. However, this particular winter, none of the owls stayed. We're not sure why they didn't. But about a month ago, Jamie Killian, our wildlife biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife, sent us some information indicating that there were others that had artificial burrows that put some artificial bird poop at the entrances. And the way they made that is they took little pebbles, painted them with non-toxic latex paint. So we did that about 2 weeks ago. And at the entrance to all of our burrows, we now have this artificial owl poop. And we're just watching to see what happens. But our goal, if it's possible, is to have permanent residents that nest here all year long. Now that takes us then to the third of the PFW projects that we installed, and that was a 50-foot wide green tree pollinator around Prairie headquarters. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services gave us a list. Actually, it was quite a long list. This was in 2013 of the type of pollinators that would grow best in Wilson County. We purchased 2,300 seedlings. Only 15 varieties were available in 2013 from L&L Growers. This is a grower down in the valley. And on planting day, these seedlings were planted by 91 volunteers from Wilson and surrounding county Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and 4-H clubs. 3 years later, we had a 74% survival rate of these seedlings. This is what planting day looked like in 2013 with young people and their adult leaders all around headquarters planting 2,300 seedlings. Now these seedlings were, they're about a foot tall when planted. 8 years later, about a year ago, this is what the outcome was or is. These plants are now serving the purpose for which they were intended, and that is to shade the ground sufficiently so that very little grass grows under these bushes. Therefore, if and when the prairie catches on fire, it can burn up to this fire break, but hopefully not burn through it to the Prairie headquarters buildings. There's another interesting feature in this photograph, and that's this trail left by the buffalo. We call the cattle, when they're on our property, buffalo, and they leave these trails. And when you're walking out on the prairie sometime and you flush some quail, they often fly to these cow trails, and you see the quail running down these cow trails. Now, the fourth of our PFW projects was to plant 10 diversity plots, 5 with deer exclusion fencing and 5 were unfenced. The purpose of these plots was to plant mostly wildflowers, and inside the diversity plots protected from deer, they would make seed, and the seed would distribute beyond the fencing of the diversity plots. To achieve this, we constructed 3 nursery tables with the capacity to produce 6,000 seedlings. Fish and Wildlife identified the seed mixes. We did the same thing we did a few years earlier. We collected what we could on the county roads. Others we purchased. We planted those seeds in 4-inch Hyco trays, grew the seedlings on the nursery tables, and then transplanted them to the diversity plots. Planting day involved a number of volunteers, and what we did was we mixed farm soil with vermiculite and osmocote, loaded that into these black trays, put the seed in, put all those trays on our tables, grew the seedlings, and then transplanted them to these fenced-in diversity plots. The plants grew, flowered, made seed. The seed then dispersed beyond the fencing of these diversity plots. Then I mentioned a little bit earlier, you fast forward a few years and we see all of these non-native grasses invading our property, seed blowing in from neighbors to the south. It's then that we proposed a 100-foot wide windbreak along our south fence, 1,600 feet long. We got another GRIP grant that helped fund this project. Our outer barrier was 50 feet width of woody pollinators. The inner barrier, 50-foot wide strip of tall grasses. This project turned out to be about the same as our fire break. It required 2,300 pollinator seedlings. This time, 23 species rather than just 15 were available from that same grower. And we planted these in October of 2019, or maybe it was 2020. It's just a little bit over a year ago. To facilitate planting, we used our subsoiler to plow these trenches about 21 inches deep. That made planting easier, but it also facilitated deep taproot penetration by the seedlings, because everybody knows that when you try to plant something like this in the South Texas climate, you're going to have some dry periods that you want these plants to survive through. Now, these seedlings are delivered in cartons like this. Each carton is full of the same type of plant. So you can't take a carton and set it out in the field and plant all over one type of plant in one area. Therefore, the day before planting, we spend about half a day with volunteers to randomize all of these 23 species of seedlings in cartons like these. And then we're ready on volunteer day. When the volunteers show up, we do a little bit discussion of how to do the planting, how to make sure we have a random distribution of plants, and everybody walks out in the field with a bunch of a load of plants, and we go to work. This particular October in 2020, we had between 40 and 50 volunteers. These were the 4-H clubs of Wilson County, Alamo area master naturalists, and other volunteers, some of whom were property owners in our area who are also interested in doing this type of restoration. And now the last couple of projects have been brought to us by folks who've been involved with restoration for a while on our prairie. In 2017, Chris Best, who's been working with us for years, gave us about 40 Manfreda seedlings that he grew on at his house. And we planted those seedlings and distributed them around on the prairie. Some of them we protected with fencing, some we did not. And then in 2021, a Texas State University student, Carolyn Wolfer, was taking some coursework on native plants, became involved with the National Butterfly Center in the Valley, and they suggested she get in contact with this Prairie Restoration Project in Wilson County. So she called us, and we certainly agreed to the study. My brother and I became involved with finding some remnant native plants last summer that we collected some seed in. We had some volunteers out on our third Saturday work day. I think this was in September of last year. And we had enough seed to plant 20 trays, which was a lot. And then we discovered just how high the germination rate was. We needed a way to be able to protect them. And we applied for a Bear Audubon Society mini grant. We were awarded that grant, which enabled us to construct predator exclusion fencing, which we did a couple of weeks ago. And then at our third Saturday work day, starting in March, we're going to plant these seedlings. This is what that project looked like. We had planted Chris's Manfreda and protected some of them in various parts of the property. And then Carolyn did her study, which in part determined where are these Manfreda likely to be successful. And when Scott and I were able to collect a bunch of seed, we needed some help planting them, and the volunteers stepped forward again. We planted these, it's about 20 trays here. Each one of these has about 40 cells in them. So we had several hundred Manfreda, but because we had a germination rate of somewhere around 80 or 90%, we have a large number of Manfreda seedlings growing on the prairie right now. Now the Butterfly Center said, well, the best way to use these seedlings is on a single property such as ours. We need, they recommended that what is needed is a population of about 500 of these adult plants to support a population of the giant Manfreda skipper. That's a butterfly that it has been on the endangered list for a while in South Texas. And some people say it's extinct, but we're going ahead with this project to get a bunch of Manfredas growing in the property. And so a couple of weeks ago, with volunteer help, we constructed this 9-foot tall fencing around 2 of our diversity plots. These plots are 100 feet by 100 feet. We're going to plant some of the Manfredas in here, and others we're going to distribute where Carolyn Wolfer has selected places in cactus groves and in dense, on the perimeters of dense brush, because that's where her study shows and where we have observed that the Manfredas are doing best. So if you want some rugged work, come out the third week in March and help us plant some of these Manfredas in these cactus groves and in the brush thickets on the prairie. And if you don't want to be quite that aggressive, or then plant some in those diversity plots that we have fenced in. Now that brings us to a really exciting project that's underway, and it's the Cornell Lab Nest Watch project. Teresa Craig is an Alamo area master naturalist who has done volunteer work on the prairie for a while, for several years, and has been very active in the bird bio blitzes. She suggested that she could introduce or initiate a Nest Watch project on the property. She became certified as a Nest Watch leader, posed to the Bear Audubon Society a request for a mini grant that would fund the construction of about 50 bird boxes and platforms, cleaned out another 50 that we had on the prairie for a long time. She has cataloged now all 100 nest sites on the prairie and has trained a few volunteers to help conduct the nest site, monitor the nest sites in our 2022 bird nesting season. So this is what this project looked like. With the grant money from Bear Audubon Society, we bought lumber, and on our third Saturday workday in December, we had 17 volunteers out there. We put up about 5 tables in the tractor shed, and we built a little over 30 bird boxes in that day. These bird boxes are of different size for different kind of birds. I think we have about 5 or 6 different sizes of boxes. Subsequent to this day, we built another 20. And the persons volunteering were from my age all the way down to this lady brought some Girl Scouts out there. And then some of the volunteers brought their own wood and made additional boxes that they could take home. So this kind of effort and these kind of projects just gets a lot of people involved, which in this case was protecting and helping our bird populations in our area. One of the most interesting parts of this Nest Watch program so far has been to clean out the 50 or so bird boxes we already had on the prairie. They had not been cleaned out for years, and almost every one had nest material in it. Like this one had 3 layers of nesting, clear evidence that birds had used this box and many others repeatedly over the past few years. And so once we got the 50 or more boxes cleaned and about 50 more installed, Teresa has cataloged every one of these into the Nest Watch program. She's recorded their coordinates, the direction the box is facing, what bird is expected to be in here, the height of the hole above the ground, and it's just a whole bunch of data. So this project is ready now for years of documentation to see how the bird population changes over time. The next was for Teresa trained other volunteers on how to conduct monitoring this spring. This is Eva Fromme, who is a landowner also in Wilson County and has been doing bird box monitoring in the past. Here they're using a boroscope to peer inside these boxes and provide minimal disturbance to the inhabitants. Now, what you heard in my description so far is describing how this restoration process has evolved. We started out with bare dirt, and in that bare dirt, we planted seed, and we've maintained it and nursed it along and engaged with some wildlife recovery projects. Here, 10 years later, we are in a situation now where we can enjoy some of the fruits of a decade worth of labor and get some special projects underway. We're actually monitoring the wildlife population out there. And 2 ways we're doing that is with bird bioblitzes and general bioblitzes. Probably most everybody on this call knows Patsy and Tom Inglet. They have organized bird bioblitzes 3 a year, spring, fall, and winter on our property. The information collected is stored in eBird, combined with about 7 or 8 prior years of bird survey data that was collected under the requirements of our conservation easement. The property now, of course, is an eBird hotspot. Now, the same thing can be said about general bioblitzes initiated and led by Peter Joseph Hernandez. Peter kicked us off with our first big bioblitz in May of last year. We're scheduled for another one this year on April 30th. We are one of those sites for the City Nature Challenge. And I'll briefly mention another one we've engaged with, and that's the farmhouse restoration. But any of you who have been on a bird bio blitz with the Englets know that they are quite a hoot. This is one of our bio blitzes. Generally, it's about 20 people. Patsy and Tom bring a bird expert for each one of our teams. We divide the property into 4 50-acre units, each one with a bird expert and 4 or 5 other people to help identify the birds. We do that for a 2-hour period, come back to headquarters, have lunch together, put that data on eBird, and then very often just sit around for a while and watch the birds there in Prairie headquarters. The general bio blitzes are the same. They generally attract a few more people because of the variety of wildlife we're looking at: plants, animals, birds, butterflies, everything. And what's really interesting is to watch some of the volunteers. They're out there, they've taken some pictures, and then they come to the experts and say, you know, I found this out there, what is it? And that always generates some very lively discussions on predators, host plants, what's living out there. And these bio blitzes are just great educational activities. So what is it that our volunteers see? Well, they see green jays. They see monarchs. There are a huge quail population. Every once in a while, somebody finds a rare plant. Like this one, I'm told is fairly rare. It's an emery milkweed. There's several of them on the property. Now, real briefly, making some comments about the farmhouse. We learned last year that the farmhouse my siblings and I grew up in was built between 1890 and 1910. And as we began to peel the sheetrock, paneling, and wallpaper off these walls, we found this beautiful century-old longleaf pine shiplap that these rooms are made out of. We found the history of the building with like this one here being a window in one of the rooms that somebody decades ago decided they didn't want the window anymore, just patched it shut. So we're restoring this as much as we can to its original conditions. If this works as we plan, we think that by this fall, we'll have enough restored on this farmhouse so that perhaps we can get it involved with ecotourism, make it available for maybe birders to come out who want to spend a weekend out on the property, or other naturalists. But we look at the house as an asset, just like the Prairie. It's an asset that has to generate sufficient revenue so that when we pass this Prairie on to the next generation, it is financially self-sustaining. We view the Prairie as not being wide open to the public, probably always controlled access, but enough activity so that people can learn from what we've done, see the wildlife out there, and then generate enough revenue so that these assets maintain themselves financially. One of the goals we had as siblings in our mission statement was that the property be used for research projects, and we wanted to engage students. And so far, we've had 6 universities involved. Baylor University graduate students have come out the last couple of summers, spent a half a day who are studying ecological ethics. Texas Lutheran University students have come out to collect native plants for their herbaria construction. UTSA graduate student has been collecting the data for our controlled test burns. Another group of students did a monarch habitats research study. I've already mentioned the Manfreda study. A UT Austin PhD candidate came out to capture some green jays to take blood samples. And his study was determining the genetics of the green jays that are living on the extremity of their range. And in January, professor from Texas A&M came out with some PhD candidates to look at the Prairie, just determine if they could do a carbon sequestration study. So we're encouraging this type of activity and would like to see that to continue in perpetuity. This is a picture of some of the Texas Lutheran students collecting plants, putting them in their, I'm not sure what they call these things, but they take them to their dehumidifier at the university and dry those plants out for their herbaria. This is a picture of the UTSA's couple students working with a couple of master naturalists doing a study of the plant populations on our controlled burn areas. So what are we doing to preserve and sustain this prairie and all the work and effort put in by volunteers and as well as our family? Well, we placed the prairie under conservation easement with the Native Prairies Association of Texas in 2013. And we are engaging that next generation that we can leave this prairie to. We started a San Antonio chapter of the Native Prairies Association of Texas. We've conducted 1 or 2 workshops a year. We couldn't do this during the pandemic, but we're resuming in April of this year. We've been conducting third Saturday volunteer work days every month now for 6 or 7 years. We provide tours to other property owners who are interested in doing the same thing. We do now have a social media presence where we can communicate what we're doing on the prairie. And finally, we want to pass the prairie on to the next generation in a financially self-sustaining situation. When I look back over the years and I hear some of the comments that people said, this one that Chris Best stated years ago has always stuck with me. He said, this restoration business takes a lot of patience, and you have to be willing to keep trying even after multiple failures. We've looked at some of our successes tonight. Well, we've definitely had failures, but we've learned from them and kept on pursuing. So before I turn this over now to questions and discussion, if you would, there's some dates you might want to put on your calendar. Our next third Saturday work day will be on March 19th. We're going to plant some of those Manfreda seedlings that you saw earlier. We have our next Bird Bio Blitz, our spring Bird Bio Blitz, Sunday, April 24th. Our all-day forage workshop with NRCS, Native Prairies Association of Texas, Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, and other groups like that are conducting this. This is scheduled for Friday, April the 29th. And our next General Bio Blitz is a part of the City Nature Challenge, and it's scheduled for Saturday, April the 30th. And we have Facebook and Instagram presence now. You can just type in Kirchoff Prairie and find us. So now I'm ready to turn the discussion back to Amanda and Peter. And while I'm doing that, I will leave my contact information up, and you're welcome to contact me at any time.
Okay, thanks, Don. Wow. It's when I signed up for Texas Master Naturalist, this is one package. You cover native grasses, plants, animals, bio blitzes. Wow, all in one same farm. I also put on the chat some of the dates because it's easier to copy and paste from there than from the screen. So unless you do a screenshot, so just an FYI, I did not put your phone number in there, but it's there on the screen if you want it. I did not see I guess you cover everything, Don. It was just a complete package here. Nicely put. Hats off to Teresa and Eva for their bird nesting project. Master Naturalist, it's great to hear that they're there doing these restoration work. So please put your questions on the chat if you have any. I did not see any come across. Amanda, I don't know if your microphone is working. But yes, just to plug in again, a third Saturday coming up is the next volunteer work day, and also Bio Blitzes on the 24th. I think I may have put the 23rd, but it's the 24th. I corrected myself. Sunday, the weekend before the City Nature Challenge. And on the City Nature Challenge, Don was one of the first ones to sign up for the Alamo or the San Antonio area City Nature Challenge. It is happening between the 29th of April through May 2nd, and where we take observations. There's 12 counties this year, and Wilson County is one of them. And to have an event on the City Nature Challenge weekend is great for us. It really takes us away from a lot of the parks during that time are very busy with people going out. Don, I think having an event, that event for the City Nature Challenge at the Kirchoff, sorry, is going to be starting at 8 till noon. Don, is that correct?
Yes.
Gates open at 7:30. You will get a big biodiversity of observations that you could really, overwhelming. I mean, just seeing the bobwhite quail there was just blew me when I was there for the bio blitz. They just came out of the grass and like you said, onto the trails. So that was neat to see. So and I saw some other birds too, and a lot of plant life, a lot of flora and fauna, definitely in this 200-acre, very dense, very nice. Okay, I do see some questions coming across, or let me just question, what's the total time did it take from date, and do you have any cost as a landowner?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been at this now for about 10 years. The first 2 years were a failure, so the last 8 were under the guidance of professional folks, and has really led us to these successes. The question of cost is really good. I don't know, and it was expensive to put the property under a conservation easement, but that's what we needed and wanted to do to make sure it was preserved in perpetuity. Gee, I don't even know. At the time we were looking at the cost for seed, we knew what that was. Much of our contribution in the way of cost, we were able to, the entities that provided funding allowed us to take all of our time, whether it was our time on a tractor or volunteer work, and put a dollar figure on that. So much of our contribution was through sweat equity, but there still was a sizable dollar. I would imagine we spent easily $100,000 in these 10 years on 200 acres. But that would have included the costs to get the conservation easement in place.
And how much of that would have been of grants, or is that a supplement besides the grants?
That's what we would have put in addition to the grants.
Right, and grant funding is also probably, half the cost, or another 100,000, you would say?
Well, it wasn't, because there was no funding for the conservation easement, and I think we spent $40,000 to $50,000 on that conservation easement.
Okay.
That was legal fees, and then they want you to put up some money for legal defense in perpetuity. So I forgot what they call that, but it was we put that money in. I don't think everybody has to do that to get a conservation easement, but it's needed, so we did it.
Right. One question that came up, let me see if it's interesting that has any of your neighbors taken up the same, that are adjacent? I know you do have invasive seeds that are flying over, grass seeds like Johnson grass, I assume, and other seeds that any other property owners around you taking this action?
Yes, I know that several of them are in different stages in their level of interest. I don't know any that has done any major planting projects yet. I know Eva Fromme is doing some of this on her property. The Creeches have their 80-acre property that they've done that. So that is a neighbor on the east side of Floresville. They're well along in their restoration process. The Ziences, whose cattle come onto our place, he has some smaller properties around Poth, and he has talked about planting those in native plants. And I think he's taken some steps. I just don't know exactly where he is in that effort.
Right. And you're still an island in where you still have a lot of farming and a lot of heavy grazing and so forth.
Yes, we are still a postage stamp in an ocean of other applications. Yes. Right. And I always like to say, hey, if we had to travel to, let's say, Austin to go to HEB, as a butterfly, we would, SOL. That's right. That's right.
So, is there a market for pastured raised beef, especially on native grasses? And I want to say yes, but go ahead. I know you.
Yes, there is. We have sold all of our hay every year, and we've sold it at a good price. This year, we're unlike every other year in the past, we're having difficulty selling it, but there's a reason for that. There was a lot of hay produced in our area, and that inventory has not yet been consumed. But we have a hay barn, we can store it, we can wait till the price is right for us. And so the answer is yes, there really is a market for it. Some people come out specifically to buy native hay. Some people buy it because we roll up the hay after the grasses have produced some seed. So there is native grass seed in that hay, and some people want it for that purpose, just to begin getting some native grasses to grow on their properties.
Right. Good question, Christopher. Jerry says, do you control burn offers the greatest opportunity for cost-effective invasive control? I know you haven't started it, but
we don't know. Right now, the belief is that it will not be effective for invasive control. The reason being, the perception is that fire will allow the invasives to come back faster, because generally they are germinating faster and they come up just a little bit earlier than the native plants do. And we're sort of in a process of testing that because we're watching to see what emerges faster, what gets a little bit taller quicker. And if indeed it's the natives, we may try some chemical treatment at the tops of plants early in the growing season to see if we can kill back the natives that are intruding on our native grasses. But right now, the expectation from most of the experts is that a burn is going to be more detrimental to a restoring prairie than just not burning at all.
Right. Okay. I don't see any other questions. A lot of good comments. Awesome presentation, and everybody was just at awe, it sounds like. Again, hopefully on our newsletter, we'll have talks or dates also, what's coming up at the Prairie. One more question here that popped up from Rachel. Would you be willing to share some of the Westatch seeds with master naturalists, please? Apparently, such a heavenly fragrance. Some people love it for the fragrance. They're blooming right now, right? Or they're starting to bloom. At least I've seen some starting to put the little yellow balls out.
Yeah, that's true. We're trying to kill it, so we don't let it get to seed. But there is plenty Westatch around us, and it makes a lot of seed, and that really causes a problem for us. Now, in our fire break, we have some plant called Weisachia, which is more of a bush and not a tree, and it is already blooming, and it's fragrant, it's pretty, and bees love it. So to answer that question is yes, You may have some Wisachia, which is more brushy, but not Wisach. That's a tree, and we're trying to kill it.
Right. So you're plucking it before it goes to seed. So
That's
uh,
yes.
okay. So for some people, a weed is a plant in the wrong place. So it's the plant in the wrong place in here at Kirchoff Farm. But
Yeah, that's
you have
true.
a
The
variety.
Wisach is native.
Yes, yes, it is, and it has its uses in certain places. Um, so Rachel, if you want the other Weisach variety, I'm pretty sure Don wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind gathering some seeds for the Native Plant Society, and sharing them amongst us where they want to grow it. Okay. And with that said, thank you we had a little technical difficulty at the very beginning, and everybody have a nice night. Thank you, Don, for a great presentation, and everybody have a great evening. Thank y'all.
Thank you.